Now, today we're talking about, will there be a world food crisis? And I mean, that's the area that I tend to work in, so I'm going to just say something briefly before Christine talks about her particular bit. And I mean, I think it's quite clear to me that yes, there will be, and in fact, yes, there already is. I mean, there's already a world food crisis because tonight, approximately 1 billion people in the world will go to bed hungry. So if that's not a world food crisis, I don't know what is. But, you know, what has happened over the last 30 years is that there actually has generally been a surplus of food in the world. And the world food crisis has been about a crisis of distribution, a crisis of fairness. I mean, there has been enough food, it just hasn't been got to the right people, or the people who need it haven't had the money to buy it. So there's been basically enough for everybody's need, but not enough for everybody's greed. But this is really changing, and so we're moving really into new territory, because both will go on with this crisis of distribution, this crisis of unfairness, to actually a systematic, chronic undersupply of food in the world. So this is really moving to new territory of both the shortage of food and problems of distribution. And why do I say there's going to be this undersupply of food? Well, it's partly it's due both to demand and supply. The demand side of the equation, really two things. One is population, and I think we know that although population, the rate of increase of population is reducing, and the good news is that it looks likely that world population will peak about 2075 at about 9.2 billion, and after that reduce slowly. That is still over 2 billion more people than we're feeding at the moment. Where the big increase in food demand comes is really from the change of diet on those people, and particularly those people who are getting richer. And what we're seeing is, with an increase in wealth, people are changing their diet. They're not so much eating more, but they're eating a different diet and a higher meat diet. And probably people are aware that if you're using grains and other feed to produce meat, you're using between 4 and 10 times as much calories to produce the meat as if you were eating it directly. So that's where there is a big crisis of increasing demand. So we've got one side, demand. At the other side, we've got an issue of supply. Now, over the last 30 years or more, actually, worldwide, we've been quite effective in increasing supply to meet demand, and that's why there's been a surplus. And that's been due to increases in agricultural production. It's the side that I tend to work on, both in the rich world and in the poor world. But will this go on? Will we be able to go on increasing the supply? Well, one of the issues one of the ways we've increased the supply is actually increase the area under cultivation. The new agricultural frontier, mainly by converting forests into farmland. And clearly that's something that can't go on indefinitely. People will differ about how quickly the forest will run out to that conversion. There's also a big issue of land degradation around the world, where the land that is under agriculture at the moment is becoming less productive for a number of reasons, but it tends to be about overuse and incorrect use of soils. We also have a more recent phenomenon that's happened really in the last 5 years, is increasing amount of land being set aside for biofuels. And actually that's particularly in the States, where there used to be a large surplus of foodstuff. That is no longer the case because a lot of that land is now being used for biofuels. There are other non-food uses of land, particularly things like cut flowers and sort of exotic vegetables all the year round, that also is a use of land that doesn't really address world food need. But there's another big issue around food supply, and that is linked to peak oil. The increase in food supply around the world, whether one's an organic support or not, has largely been due to the use of fossil fuels to produce relatively cheap fertilizer, inorganic fertilizer, and mechanization of agriculture that has made land more productive in the short term. But it's clear with rising oil prices that many poor farmers can no longer continue to buy fertilizer. And I've just come back on Wednesday from work in both Ghana and Kenya with farmers, and they were saying to me quite clearly that they can no longer afford the fertilizer that they have been using in recent years, and they can no longer afford the fuel for their tractors. So there's a big issue there. The other thing that's quite clear, and this is, I get it all the time in Africa, is climate change. And farmers in Africa are saying absolutely categorically that their climate is changing. It's not necessarily getting hotter or colder, it's not even getting drier. What it's getting is much less predictable. And whereas they could predict that more or less at this time, you know, for southern Africa around October, November, when it started raining, then it would be the rains. Now sometimes it starts in August, sometimes it starts in January. They're not sure when the first rains come is that they should rush out and use their seed and plant, or whether this is just a false shower and wait. So that whole ability to understand the climate has changed. So that is affecting production quite markedly. And finally, the whole issue of water. We know in many areas, particularly in northern India, agricultural expansion has been very successfully based on historic archaeological aquifers of water that have been pumped and pumped and pumped, and they're falling, and that cannot go on because they're not getting replenished at the rate that they're being used. Many of the world's sort of river basins are being affected. Basically all the water now is being used for irrigation. So there is an issue about water for irrigation that can't go on expanding. So we're entering at the moment a phase of structural shortage of food. And what's happening is that's being reflected by high prices. And that's clear worldwide at the moment. Grain prices are at a historic high. It's quite good news for some farmers, but many poor farmers are actually, although they produce some, they also buy some, so it's very bad for poor people. It's actually fomented an explosion in interest in agribusiness and a great demand for land in places like Africa as big companies try and move into the new opportunities caused by high prices. You know, there's land grabs going on, there's a whole new environment of struggle around land developing.
An area the size of Dorset was leased out in Ethiopia for £150 a month, so less than the cost of the rent of a very small bedsit. And this is to a company that will export palm oil from Ethiopia. And they're given tax breaks so that the country won't get any tax from it, they won't get any profit beyond this £150 a month. That's just from last week. And
there's the issue of food speculation, and I'm going to stop here and I think hand over to Christine as, to finish off the talk. Is that fair enough?
Great.
Okay, thank you.
Are people alright if I stay here?